everyone, and welcome to another video. In this video, I will be discussing a topic that is rather of interest to not just the Canadian people, but of interest going forward to us as Albertans in our decision making when we must now consider the factors behind the idea of separating from Canada. Now, one idea that one must particularly think about in this particular notion is when Quebec has been voting for the idea of separating this entire time, nobody batted an eye. But now that it's Alberta that's threatening to separate, suddenly all of Canada is saying that Albertans are essentially crazy. So, where in the split do we see the nature at which we can actively see the stance change between those that provide and those that leech? In terms of Canadian economy, our wealth is as a result of Albertan oil. We might have other trades such as lumber and water, on and on and on and on, which is a factor, but is not the primary generator of our wealth, which we hold within Alberta. But in the topic of interest now, if I may bring it up, allow me to place an analysis upon environmentalism. In understanding environmentalism, we could actively say the measure of environmentalism is upon reaching zero net emissions, which in the idea of zero net emissions, if one were to look at it from the perspective of every time I pull a cubic meter of soil out, I replace it with a regenerated same level of cubic meter back in. And so in the net zero emissions, we would actively have to see in Alberta, in order to see a net zero in our oil sands, just as any oil sand area present within the world, because that is what oil comes from, is bitumen, is found in the ground. The reason you no longer have bitumen in oil, such as in Saudi Arabia, is when you dig deep enough into the ground and you hit the core of the well. Now, in terms of the net zero emissions, if we as Albertans wish to maintain the environment of our ozone, specifically to the Alberta atmospheric region, because this is how global warming develops, folks. If you do not reach a net zero of carbon or environment emissions, which is its carbon footprint, because if you remove a cubic meter of soil and do not replace it with the same content of that previous cubic meter of soil, you then see a change in atmospheric pressure based on the chemistry of said cubic meter. And the more we do not meet the rate at which we can match this particular rhythm, eventually you see a deterioration in the ozone of said region. And now when we analyze the regions of the world that have essentially developed as a result of oil wealth, you could actively see in each of those particular countries, within each of those particular regions, is a individual particular ozone, which is different, and it has separate alternate cycles within each of its individual seasons. You would then see a alternate polarity within each of those individual seasons, such as the winter Chinooks we experienced in South Alberta. Now, in understanding that these regions are not predominantly just found in Canada alone, we as a country can now actively see that this takes place in other places in the world. And in that particular statement, you could then say, well, if other countries are doing it, why can't we? And then the environmental argument is, if they're doing it, we should be showing the way. And if we are to be showing the way, in essence, if in order to reach a net zero means for every meter I pull out, I put another meter back of the same exact potential at generating the atmosphere. But in order to do so, drives up the price at which we can sell our oil. And in doing so, if the price of our oil goes up in exchange for maintaining the environment or the atmospheric level of the ozone pressure, at which the chemicals of the ozone then generate our breathing air, resulting in our climate. If we do not meet this particular net zero, our regional atmosphere based directly above our region in the sky changes, and we see a change in the seasons in exchange for increasing our oil prices. But then you might ask, well, why aren't other places doing that? And that's where we get essentially the meat of the argument. In essence, if we wish to lower the price of our oil, we need to make it more easily distributed, which means we need to sacrifice a portion of surrounding environment to create a cleaner transporting way, such as a pipeline, rather than transporting our oil using a train track, which has a tremendous risk potential. And you might say, well, why don't we just veer away from oil in total? I may get to that point in a second now, if you may, because in understanding the fundamental chemistry behind diesel and gasoline, you can actively see how these different fuel types are also a paradox. If diesel is less refined bitumen, which from the bitumen you then, through lesser process, you then generate diesel, and from diesel you then break it down more and more and more and more and more the more you dilute it, until you essentially arrive at gasoline. The difference between gasoline and diesel is because diesel is a more concentrated level of this particular compound found in the bitumen, because it is in a more concentrate and less dilute method, it combusts at a greater potential firing power. Because it is a more condensed state, it does not burn at the same temperature, it combusts at a higher potential power. at a lower temperature, so it does not burn to a flame through oxygen. In the understanding now of diesel is the properties of gasoline, which is specifically more diluted forms of diesel. And the more you dilute the gasoline, the higher in its octane compound it increases. Which all of a sudden we're higher selling diesel prices, and the further in the octane opposite you go, which is technically a worse gasoline at that particular point, because you would have to generate or create a more powerful firing combustion chamber in order to fire that particular level of octane in the gasoline, which now we have to sell vehicles specifically branded just for a 93 octane brand. You then see that the business model around oil is not in the selling portion of things that we went wrong, because that has been very successful, because we're breaking bank trying to keep up with these oil prices. But in the understanding of the actual combustion at which the oil can be used in order to then generate a zero net emission. And this process can be understood when you analyze the way bitumen formulates in the ground. In any region of the world, according to the thickness and density of the dryness of its crust, if it was not of a tropical environment in nature, you would see that blue clay sits relatively close to the crust of the surface of the Earth's crust, which we stand on. Which in that particular blue clay is the beginning formulation of bitumen, hence why the clay turns a grayish blue. If you dig slightly deeper beyond that blue clay, you arrive at the initial bitumen, which is the mixture of soil and oil together, which we must now pull the soil and oil apart to isolate the oil. And understanding now that based on the fact that anytime you hit blue clay is technically oil, this invites the idea now that technically, if you are of an Alberta or Canadian landowner, you should be able to dig anywhere on your land and see if you can find blue clay. However, we have legislation in place that prevents you as a landowner from being able to dig more than a meter below the surface of your property. And the idea they tell you is, well, in the middle of nowhere on your land, we just don't want you to hit utilities. Okay, great. I'll let you know if I hit a utility. Thank you. Because now you can actively see, if you live anywhere in Alberta, you could actively test this out. Is there blue clay on your land? Well, I don't know. Alberta is full of blue clay, which means you should be able to find blue clay anywhere, within even your backyard, or even a city with a river that runs through it. Because at the base of the river is where you find the living water, also known as oil, which is a basis of another water, which is a mixture of life mixed with water that has decomposed and then creates a potential firing power. in the understanding of now how oil is created and can be found in all atmospheres or places of tropic nature, you could actively see now that Alberta used to be a place of tropic environment millions of years ago, which is a teaching they teach in the Drumheller Museum. Now going into the actual oil combustion portion of things, as I further the process of the combustion, in order to reach a net zero, we must understand how the neutralizing of the oil itself in the world works naturally, which in order to isolate or neutralize the emission of the continuously flowing oil at the core of the earth, where in this freely flowing oil, as if you are, imagine now if I am holding a vial with a vase or a base sphere to it, and as I put a flame or a heat source and I simply create a diagonal pattern of rotation, you would actively see that this well is flowing throughout the base of the earth, and this creates, in a sense, the earth's diagonal shifts, resulting in seasons. Based on this oil reserve now, in order to isolate the heat process of this heat exchange resulting in the living water of oil, resulting in the formulation of compounds emitted through ground able to create the fertilization of plant life, which then themselves create the neutralizing of air. How do you create that neutralization? In the water process of things, which is exactly how you learn how to combust diesel properly. The moment you no longer combust diesel with a oxygen air molecule, but with a water air molecule, you would find that the hydrogen of the water molecule creates a neutralizing of the carbon monoxide and creates carbon or the one you actually see in air. I can't remember the name of it. It'll come to me. If it does not, I would suggest you do some research and simply find a way to ask Google, does water oxygen molecules, or does water oxygen neutralize diesel emissions? And you would find that in the process of the chemistry itself, the addition of a hydrogen molecule rather than just solely an oxygen molecule creates a neutralizing state of the emission of the byproduct known as carbon monoxide and turns it into a different carbon. And then this carbon is the carbon you find is what feeds plant life. And the moment we can transfer from the carbon hydroxide, the carbon monoxide into a carbon hydroxide, that is the term I was looking for, carbon hydroxide. The moment we can turn from carbon monoxide into a carbon hydroxide, we then see a change, and we may fact check me if you wish, because it might be a just different perspective at which I'm explaining it, but in the fundamental reality behind it, the moment you introduce a water oxygen molecule carrying a hydrogen molecule, you then create a net zero emission within the combustion solely of diesel, which in itself is a more potent firing power. And so now you might ask, well, why did we first start using diesel in the first place? Well, I don't know. How would you like to use hundreds of men to move a trailer weighing 40,000 pounds? We would essentially never have left the era of slavery if we did not find a more efficient way to replace the human workers, which meant we needed to create machines, and in order to create machines, we needed to create a fuel. The problem in creating the fuel now was we could create a business model that sold itself in order to not just harvest the fuel, but in the consumption of the fuel, resulting in the deterioration of the earth, which would then require us to conquer other planets in our exchange of offering electric fucking vehicles. Now, in terms of how electric vehicles work, well, you could say in the cold of winter, those hydrogen batteries sure don't work. Because in hydrogen, in cold temperatures, hydrogen enters a freezing state. And under a freezing state, energy is no longer vibrant within the molecular level of a molecule, such as a chemical that creates the acid that is in a hydrogen battery, which is what we base our electric vehicles off of. And if we were to now, in the liberal ideology of things, to push for the electric vehicle push that by 2035 we will all be having to drive electric vehicles, well, why don't we analyze the current electrical grid then? Which per city block, if you were to measure the wattage that you can actively maintain the grid with, you can only actively charge 4 electric vehicles per city block at the current state of infrastructure. Which means if we want within now 9 years have all electric vehicles for over 30 plus million Canadians, well, that infrastructure would have had to have been put in place a damn long time ago. And so where do we plan on storing the energy, because we do not have the electrical grid able to withstand storing or relaying this particular level of wattage? Well, the Canadian government, in its liberal ideology, specifically stated, well, just as any particular Canadian would say, we'll get Alberta to do it because they have been our backbone the whole time. And in the understanding that even Danielle Smith, in her mathematical equation of things, realized that in order to store that much energy per hour in order to sustain all of Canada for the dang electric vehicle scheme they're trying to run, would cost about $1 billion per hour in order to store that much energy for every Canadian. But that would be at the cost of Albertan economy. And so now we see where we want a separation. But in understanding the concept of separation and reducing not just the price of our oil, but increasing our carbon emission, which we can alter through the combustion of our diesel, not with oxygen air molecule, but as well with water air molecule, rather than the diesel exhaust fluid that which we sell currently, which is ammonia, which is basically horse piss. We would see a cleaner emission with a hydrogen water molecule attached to the oxygen. But now in understanding the carbon emission of net zero in terms of cubic meter per cubic meter, in order to reduce our emission, we need to increase the price of our oil, which means if we want to increase our cell potential, we need to increase or decrease the cost at which we have to spend in order to disperse it. Which now means if we were to separate, well, guess what? British Columbia sure shit ain't gonna run a pipeline to the ocean for us. And going south might be an option, but in the estimate that which we have been given, we would still have to invest over hundreds of billions of dollars out of Albertan economy. And so I would argue that in the succession of Canadian politics in its economic state, if we wish to pull out of debt rather than seeking to trade outwards, we should be seeking to trade inwards. We should actively be utilizing the Albertan oil, creating refineries and learning processes that which we can create our vehicles to run not just off of a hydrogen combustion, which is rather simple. You simply just have to create and add a water tank to your diesel tank and mix the two in the combustion process. But now going forward into the ability of relaying our oil inwards, if we would need to reach a zero net emission, we would actively need to create a way to not just disperse, but lower the rate at which we can maximize the amount of oil we can squeeze out of the soil. Which means now if per dilution of diesel we create into gasoline, well then, screw gasoline. Welcome to the diesel era, which is the initial fuel we were supposed to run with a hydrogen molecule attached to oxygen in the combustion. Because at the combustion we see it neutralizes and creates a different form of carbon, from carbon hydroxide into carbon monoxide. Pardon my previous misunderstanding, I have just made the correction. Going forward beyond that point, when you mix all of this together and lowering the price to increase the net zero, and the way we not only just squeeze the amount of oil by reducing the gasoline dilution and primarily focusing on diesel production, we now see we are getting more oil per soil. And based on that, we can create a model. We could actively run all of Canada on its own natural resources without ever having to have a trading partner again. We could become a sovereign country. And other people of other nations would seek to either come into Canada to live, or they would seek to take over Canada based on its sovereign nature. But based on the liberal backbone we are ran by, we are too afraid to take the leap of faith, which is, forget Alberta sovereignty, how about Canadian sovereignty? How about that? Does that sound appealing to you as a Canadian viewer? Well, then I suggest we start looking at future options in potential government forms, rather than solely focusing on the polar opposite of things. Let's meet in the middle. Thank you.